Hello, everyone. My name is Manic, and to all my Dirt Rally 2.0 subscribers, we're going to be doing something a little bit different today. I'm actually going to be working with a Assetto Corsa Competizione workspace in MoTeC. And while you can also do this in Dirt Rally 2.0, a lot of these channels are only specific to Assetto Corsa. So for all those that are brand new to my channel, welcome, and let's get right into it. So what I'm going to be talking about is my workspace, and it's a very specific one. It's something that I find that not a lot of other workspaces use this kind of data, at least to the extent that I use it. And I have a link in the description that will tell you all about what a lot of these channels do. But anyways, how about we get right into it? So we're going to start off, I'm going to show you where all these different tabs are. Okay, so up here in the top left corner, I have a pull down menu, and we see we have a bunch of different workbooks that we can look at here. So the one that I'm going to be focusing on today is Manic Basics. Okay, the base one is the default one that comes with your ACC workspace, but this is the one that I use, that I have made a compilation of, that is just my basic channels. And then it'll give you a good overview of the kind of things that you'll find in this channel, or in my workspace. So first off, we're going to start off, we're going to be looking at driver activity. This shouldn't be anything brand new. I have this included on every single workbook at the front. Just because it's a very good reference to always have, okay? So it shouldn't be anything brand new. You know, you have your speed, your throttle, your brake traces, you got your steering angle, and also gear changes. Very simple, nothing unique about this. Moving on to our second page here, we have the G-forces channel. Same idea, we have the speed channel at the front, up top, and then we have the G-lateral and G-long channel together here. And just a little small change here, I have the longitudinal Gs whenever the traction control is activated. So you can see in these little red spots, like where you may have your traction control kicked in. And it's just something it's a visual thing, just to see where those events typically happen, and if it affected your performance in any way. You can take a quick gander at it, see what it does. And finally, we have the combined G channel, which I explained in one of my posts on the ACC forums, which is basically a combined vector value of both lateral Gs and long Gs. And if that's already too much, don't worry about it. It's basically combining both your lateral and long Gs. So it lets you know if you're using the maximum amount of grip available to you. So for instance, if we take a look at, let's say, at the end of hanger straight, and there's a nice big braking zone into stow, we can see that as soon as we apply the brakes, go into negative Gs, we can see the combined Gs shooting up, and it kind of goes up and down. You know, that'll tend to happen as the aero lessens and the downforce lessens. You lose a little bit of grip, but this gives you an idea of just how stable it is, and like if it remains consistent. And these little dips like this, that can give you an indication maybe if you broke too soon, or maybe you broke too late as well. So it gives you a quick idea as to what your performance was in a particular section. In this case, it looks like that we just immediately started turning in. So it gives you an idea of like how through each phase of the corner, how your grip levels change. Okay, and it's a very nice reference to have, just to give you an idea if you're doing well or not. This can be a little bit tricky to decipher. But you kind of get the hang of it after a while. And also, I have listed where traction control kicks in, this light blue space, and then also where the ABS kicks in, obviously in the braking zones here. Okay, moving on from G-forces, we can go to our Variance tab. Now, this is going to be, this is quite an important tab for me anyway, because it gives me an idea as to, this is a different way that I look at a Variance channel. So if I press the F3 key, it gives us our variance channel. I already have a lap loaded here, and you know, this is typically what everybody is used to. You know, so every time it goes up, it's like, okay, this is where I'm doing better. When it goes below, okay, I'm doing much worse. If I turn on the overlay here, you can see that we have a couple different ways of looking at variance. Now, I have like I said, I have a post on the ACC forums that explains how all this works, so I'm just going to go over this quickly. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So first one is instantaneous variance here. So that's the rate at which I am gaining on the other lap. So every time it's positive, like for instance here, I have a maximum of gaining about 0.8 seconds per second, if that makes sense. Okay, so it gives me, at a quick glance, I can be like, okay, this is where I'm doing the best. Like right about here, I'm gaining at about 1.3 tenths, which is quite good. And this is where I'm doing the worst. This is like the bottom here at the loop. Didn't do so well at those hairpins there. So it's like, okay, that's exactly the places I should be focusing on maybe, or at least with the data comparing these two laps, this is where I did the worst. Next is this delta section variance, which is basically taking this cumulative variance up here, the F3, and just chunking it up per section. And I have a whole post about how to make sections and things to consider for that. But anyways, these shapes are kind of, they tend to have like a pattern to it, so you can once again tell pretty easily, like, oh, was it a braking problem? Was it a steering problem? Is there something else going on? Like, you typically can tell what's going on. You know, in like these sweepers here, for instance, it's like, okay, I got a really bad exit, so this other lap gained on me much more. And it also gives you an idea of how much you actually gain or lose depending on how good your exit was, you know, and it's a lot less than you think it would be. But anyway, going back to this, so anytime it's in the positive region, for instance, if I'm looking at just Beckett's, you can see I did pretty good here. But by the time I get to hanger straight, I'm actually losing on my lap. Okay, so it's a pretty easy way to tell how I'm doing section by section, because obviously each lap is not going to be the most perfect lap, right? And sometimes it's harder to tell when you have this cumulative thing. It's like, okay, you kind of have to chunk it up and use the data cursor to measure the differences here. And while you can do it with this, sometimes it's just easier to just look directly at the section variance and be like, okay, this is where I did better or worse. Okay. And then finally, I have here at the bottom the variance gain and variance loss, and that just sort of tells me, okay, so if we took a look at stow, for instance, you can see like, okay, I gained a lot at the beginning, but by the time I got to the end of stow, that's when I started losing out. So it gives me just an even clearer picture as to when these changes started to occur, so I can really sort of pinpoint when, or sort of take a very good look at what the trade-offs are. Because I can see here that I've gained 3.7 tenths, and by the end of it, I only lost about 1.4 tenths. So I can be like, okay, so the entry was quite important versus the exit, at least when comparing these two different laps. Okay, so that's kind of like a useful shortcut to figuring out your performance throughout a lap, or at least comparing it to a different lap. Moving on to the next tab, we have section times. And this is going to just give me an idea of like my consistency through the stint, okay? So these blue boxes are going to tell me the fastest times through these various sections. For maggots, my fastest time was 2.8, and the rest of these are pretty slow. So red typically is about more than 2% slower. Yellow I have designated, I think, at 2%, and green is about 1%. So if it's within 1%, that's okay. It depends on your skill level. If you're, if you're like an alien or whatever, you'll probably want to do about 0.5%, and yellow be 1% in terms of consistency. But again, like this just gives me a very quick indication as to, once again, like the consistency of each section. So I can look at turn 16 at Brooklands and be like, okay, I have a problem here because it's all red and only one blue. So that means this is a section that I should really start focusing on in terms of like my driving, really paying attention to why I'm not getting consistent times here. Same with Village. And you'll see often with the straights that like, well, in my case, I'm having some problems with the, or for the section right before Wellington here. So the loop, I'm probably having problems that is causing slower times at Wellington. But you'll see, for instance, like at the end of Woodcote or something like that, that straights typically don't have a lot of variation. It's really about all the performance of the corner before a straight that's really the most important. So that's always something to consider too. So For instance, if Wellington is looking really bad, I could probably gain a lot of time just by focusing on turn 13 and turn 14. If I can maximize my exit speeds in these two sections, then I'll see a lot of improvement on the straight following it. Okay. And finally, there's these two values down here. Eclectic, which is just adds up all your fastest times down here to give you an idea of like what could possibly be your fastest lap if you were absolutely perfect. And also a rolling minimum, which is something that MoTeC does. They really haven't explained how they calculate this, but basically giving you like an average of what you can expect on average, what your lap time will probably be more realistically. I don't really use this, but in any case, it's more important is looking at the consistency of your section times and really nailing those down. Moving on to the next tab, we have curvature, and I have a whole post about this. And this gives me a very quick glance as to which section has the slowest corner. So the taller they are, the slower the corner. Okay, so the loop is going to be the slowest section, of course, because we have the biggest maximum here. Let me turn off the overlay. And we can see here that these are our slower corners, which, I mean, they are important, but, you know, very often we want to focus on the slowest corners because usually they proceed like a straight. So if we can maximize the times in the slowest corners, then we can gain a lot of time on the straight following it. So it's very good for just getting a sense of how smooth you're going through a corner. Also, if you're doing a late, early, or traditional apex. But anyway, I have a whole post about that you can look at. But this is a very useful channel. The next tab is Understeer, Oversteer. Now, this is going to be pretty confusing. I have just written a post about understeer angle. I haven't done one about attitude velocity yet, but with understeer angle, I've given a little bit of an explanation on how to do this. So up here we got the speed channel, of course. Always got to have the speed channel. And then we have the steered angle and the Ackerman angle, which when we get the difference between the two, gets us an understeer angle, okay? So it's telling us basically, so if I was to look in the section right here at maggots, okay? If you look at the yellow line here, you see this difference here is going to produce the understeer angle for me. So that blue line is telling me, okay, if I was to take a particular corner without any slip angle, this is how much the tires need to be turned, okay? Versus the steered angle, which is where my steering wheel actually is at. Okay, so that's going to tell me it's a very rough description of slip angle. Obviously, you're not getting the slip of every single tire. You're just getting sort of an idea of like how your steering wheel is affecting the attitude of the car. Okay, and it's represented here by the understeer angle. So I have a red line here that's kind of a rough guideline as to when you may be turning in too much. So this 4-degree value is kind of places where like, okay, I think I might have to check what's going on. So positive values are going to give you is going to be basically understeer, right? Because your steering angle is turning more than what the actual direction of the car is going, okay? And oversteer is going to be in these little valleys down here. Because we can see that you're steering, like you're still turning basically, despite your steering wheel trying to correct itself. So it's usually an indication that you are counter steering or just changing direction in the middle of a chicane. So that's something to look out for too. But anyway, the important thing about understeer angle, I'm not going to go into it, but because I have a post about it, but is that you have to modify what your steering ratio is in the ACC settings. And this is an unfortunate thing that you have to change if you want to get correct values for your understeer angle. And you can do that by going over to this quick tab over here, and we can adjust this little dial to the bottom left here. So I have it at 18 because that's what the McLaren is at for its default. But if you're, say, in the Ferrari or something, it's like 13, if I'm not mistaken. So what you have to do is you have to adjust this dial. Unfortunately, you have to use the wheel itself to actually change the values for your understeer angle. And you'll see when I change it to 13 that the values have all changed now. Okay, so before this was like by the red line, but now it's almost 3 degrees higher. Okay, so that's why it's so important that you adjust this value, because if you don't, you're going to get a wrong impression about how well that you were driving this particular car. Okay, I mean, you can still derive some information from it, but unfortunately for each car, it's dependent on the steering ratio, so you're always changing this value according to what it is in the game settings. So I'm going to leave it on 18, and you can see just how much it changes. And if I go all the way to 11, like it really goes. I mean, we're now up to 8.3 or something like that. Like that's a big difference, almost double the difference there. So that's why changing this value is quite important to get the right value. It's also very annoying that you have to change it. So that's why I also have attitude velocity, which is a different way of looking at understeer, oversteer. I haven't written a post about this yet, but I will get that up as soon as I can. I've actually finished it. I just have to get everything together. But basically, it's this one. Instead of looking at just like the steering wheel and the difference in degrees, we're actually looking at a rate. So this is degrees per second. Okay, so this is actually telling me like how fast is the car actually rotating, and it's used. You find it using specific yaw rate, which is its own logged channel here. And it's the same idea. It looks at the difference between what it would look like if you didn't have slip angle versus if you do, which is the yaw rate here. And this is a much more complex, much more difficult way of looking at car balance, but it's much more accurate, and you don't have to change the values here. I will say that this is not an easy channel to observe, so you really kind of have to spend some time with it if you want. I would consider understeer angle to be the easiest way to understand your car balance. Okay, so I would say start with understeer angle and do your edit. Make sure that your steering ratio is correct. Get a feel for that first, and then work your way to attitude velocity, because this reveals actually quite a lot about individual characteristics of your car, and you don't have to change any values to get the correct values, which is Yahtzee, right? Okay, so moving on, let's go to gearing. Very simple: speed, RPMs. Oh, let me zoom out. RPMs with the traction control activated, throttle position, gear numbers, and also gear changes per lap. So this tells me how many times I changed the gears by the end of it. So if I did an overlay, we can see here that the other lap I changed gears 29 times versus the main lap here, which is 28 times. And I mean, we can see it right here, but at least it gives me a counter as to how many times it changed. And, this gives me an idea as to my consistency throughout the lap. So this is something if you're really trying to drill consistency and making sure that you got all your gear changes in the right place on the lap, this is somewhere that you want to look. Okay, moving on. The RPM graph, this is actually from the ACC workspace. Same thing, just without the histogram. Nothing particularly new or surprising about this. Then we have suspension data. We have the travel up here and the damper velocities down here. I have it color-coded in maybe a different way than a lot of people use it. So if I was to look here, so red indicates the right side of the car, blue indicates the left side of the car, the darker colors are the front of the car, the lighter colors are the rear of the car. Okay, hope that's not too confusing. But you can see here, just by looking at this, I can tell that, okay, the right side of the car is compressed versus the left side. And it switches, so it's like this is a chicane, obviously, we're at Vail Club. And I use this color coding for everything regarding the individual tires. And it just makes it a lot easier because I can immediately look at it. Oh, okay, this is the rear right of the car is hitting some curvature here, right? It's very easy way to look at it. Usually looking at the suspension channels by itself, it doesn't really teach me too much. It's all about like what you can derive from these channels, which I'll get into in another video, in another series of posts, hopefully. Okay, so let's zoom out again. Okay, next we have the new tab here, which is the pressure adjustment tab. And this is actually just kind of like a way for me to get the correct tire pressure changes that I want. Because I do a lot of hot lapping. I like to do that just for testing because it gives me like consistent results, you know? What this does is that it gives me an idea as to how I can spend the most time in the ideal pressure range, okay, is the way that I have set this up, and for each particular tire. So in this instance, I have the front left, front right, front left tire, front right, rear left, and rear right tire, okay? And so that's these 4 channels up here. And I can tell immediately just by looking at this average channel and be like, okay, it looks like that I will need to reduce the pressure a little bit here, okay? Because sometimes I'm getting up to negative 0.3, so it's like, okay, then I have to reduce it by 0.3 PSI, right? Very easy. I can just like look at it immediately and be like, okay, this is the pressure that I need to do. And I can do that for each tire. It's very simple. The standard deviation value just tells me how much variation there is. So even though so this actually, it tells me that this was a bit of an outlier, my main lap, because it's negative 0.3, so it ran quite hot, but also there was a lot of variation, so I probably overworked the tires on this particular lap. So that gives me a good indication if this is a reliable figure or not. But anyway, it's just very simple. I can just look immediately, and, you know, for all the different tires too, so I can look at the wet pressure and be like, oh man, I'd have to raise the pressure by 2.6, 2.7. You know, it's very quick, very easy, and it's better than like trying to just guess or just figure it out through the menus, because it's based off of the actual tire pressure values that you get off of the logs. So it's very accurate as well. Okay. Speaking of which, let's look at the pressure and temperature traces. So it's obviously going to tell us how the pressure and the temperature changes over the course of the lap. And you can see what I'm talking about here. This green region is the ideal region for the most recent tires, dry tires. Okay, so the average is going to try to pull down and make sure that you stay in this green region as long as possible. Because it's hot lapping, you'll notice that that it actually drops whenever you cross the start-finish line, okay, because it resets the values. So that's why I use average, because if I used maximum or minimum, it's going to screw up the values. But anyway, so that's why it was telling me, like, oh, you need to reduce it by 0.3, because it's like you can spend more time in this region if you do. And that would reduce this maximum. You know, sometimes it's very hard. There's no way that you can stay in this green region all the time. Especially if you're hot lapping. So you try to do the best you can and make sure that your values aren't going all over the place, so to speak. Okay, so yeah, and it gives, you can see immediately, like, okay, with the color coding too, it's like, okay, the left front tire pressure is really high, and that's typically the case anyways. Like, you're always going to see this value. The front left tire usually be the hottest and usually have the highest pressure. The next set of channels down here is the tire temperature, of course. I have a green line again to indicate what would be like the ideal maximum, and then there's what you don't want is going to be much lower than this. I think it's like in the 70s or something like that. Same idea, but what I also have down here is the wheel temperature speed, which is a very interesting channel. It gives you an indication as to what parts of the track is where you really worked your tires. So I can tell just by looking at this that my front left tire was worked super hard at Stowe by the end of it, okay? You can see like that the rate increased a lot during that whole time. And that's generally what's going to happen, right? Whenever you go through any sort of lateral cornering or of any sort, like, you're going to get higher temperatures, right? Depending on which side of the car it is, what kind of corner it is. And then, of course, it also shows you like where you start losing temperature, which is nice. Okay, so obviously on the straights, we can see that our front left tire loses a lot of temperature, which is nice. Okay, so that's a really interesting set of traces to look at because it's going to tell you if like why your pressures and your temperatures are fluctuating. Okay, and that's much easier to look at than this very smooth lines because sometimes it's not particularly obvious that this right here is where you gain the most temperature, right? Because it just looks so smooth. But really, if you can look at the rate of temperature gain and loss, it's very obvious as to what's happening. And once again, color-coded to sort of tell you what's going on. Okay, so that does it for my Manic Basics workbook. And I hope to do some more videos for the other workbooks because it only gets more complicated from here. But I hope that this was a good intro to the ACC Workspace. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments, and I will try my best to get to answer them. So thanks again, and have fun racing.